right. Oh, I'm actually on. Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. I know it's like the last session of the day. It's been like a really long week, and there's a lot of incredible stuff going on at the same time. So really, thank you for coming out and supporting me. And yeah, I'll just get right to it. So I'm Julia Keren-Detar. I'm a game designer at Untame. We're an indie studio, and we made a game called Mushroom 11. So last year, I gave a talk on early American board games, and I was kind of surprised at how gender neutral these games seemed to me. So for example, one of the games I talked about last year was the Checkered game of life. This was Milton Bradley's first game. He designed this in 1860, and the game involves players navigating life's ups and downs to try to get to happy old age. 100 years later, to celebrate the forming of the company, Milton Bradley redesigns the game of life, and among other changes, players now control a family unit made up of mixed-gendered pieces. Now, this change didn't really affect the game design. It didn't even affect the narrative to a great extent, but it did show gender in this way that didn't exist in the earlier version. Another game I talked about was Candyland. This, on the image on the left, is the first edition from 1949, and the image on the right is another edition from 1978. During the 80s, they introduced these characters along the game path, like Lord Licorice and Princess Lollipop, and as the decades wear on, these characters started to get more exaggerated toward their gender. The image on the right is from the board in 2010. And here's the box art from 2013. Now, Candyland's mechanic never changed. The narrative itself never changed. You always have boys and girls starting at the lower bottom corner of the game. But again, gender's sort of represented in this way that, wasn't in the earlier versions. So I was curious about what other examples I could find looking back at history to see if there was like gender roles that changed or stayed the same. So I'm going to talk about a few examples of games that you might be very familiar with and games that you might not know as much, and talk about what I found. So for most of human history, games and toys have been used as a way to teach children on the roles and responsibilities they'll have as adults, right? And for most societies, there's gender associated to different types of tasks that you could have. These are a series of ancient Greek toys, and you can see like there's a woman baking bread and a woman taking care of a baby, and you have a man planting seeds and working in the fields. So you have this kind of gender association just in terms of, training kids on what they would do when they grow up. In addition to this, there also seems to be different types of game spaces or game structures that different groups of genders prefer over others. So in 1985, there was a researcher, Marjorie Goodwin. She wrote a book called The Serious Side of Jump Rope, and she studied girls playing jump rope, and she wanted to know more about how children use games, not as these escapist activities that people would go to and sort of, to get away from the world, but they actually helped children inform their own behavior that would help them process complex issues in the real world. So they're not separate experiences. And what she found was that there were different play structures between boys and girls. So girls who play with each other, they tend to be really selective with who they play with. There's an emphasis on pre-game alliances, social standing, even appearances in terms of who even gets to play in the play space, and then in terms of establishing turn order or who would be on what team. The games themselves seem to be really flexible in terms of the goals. So the idea or the point of the game could change over the course of gameplay. And if disputes arise, they would usually be solved by forming coalitions of 2 against 1. So there's always this sort of we, come together to resolve this problem, or we beat you out, this ally's relationship is stronger than just yours. Then for boys, it's a little bit different. So they tend to be more open with who they play with, but there's a more emphasis on the kind of outcome of the game. So whether that's competition or winning or doing a cool trick or something. And that ends up influencing the outside game space after the game is played. There's sort of a restructuring of social hierarchy based on who kind of best did or who showed off cool. The interesting thing about jump rope, though, is that between the 1600s and 1700s, when it was first being written about in Europe and the Americas, jump rope was actually a competitive sport that was only for boys. It was seen as too physically demanding for girls to play with. It wasn't until around the 1800s and 1900s that girls completely took over, transforming the sport of jump rope into the game of jump rope. Likewise, the other example I showed, which was like a football variant, originated in Europe in the Middle Ages. And this game came out of this really crazy event called mob football or Shove-tide football. And this is when an entire village would like sort of shut down. All the men would come out and they would like play this game, and the rules were really simple. Get one ball from one side of the village to the other, or if you were playing against multiple towns, it would be to get one from one town to the other town, by any means necessary. So they would like beat each other up, they would like punch each other, they would like start riots, they would like burn stuff down. It was insanely out of control. And so hence the name mob football. Oddly enough, since the 12th century in Scotland, there's a documentation of an all-women's mob football game, which seems to be just as crazy and rough and outrageous. However, the structure was a little different, so it was always played by married women against single women, and it was historically documented that the married women won, kind of giving this idea that like married women are somehow more superior than single women because of their relationship status with men. So from these two examples, you could see like how historical like gender has been really kind of blurred. And you know, there does seem to be these play differences between the genders, but it's really unclear how much of that is cultural and how much of that is biological. So in terms of board games, historically there seems to be like kind of two genres of games. You have luck-based racing games where you race your opponent to the end of the board by like using dice or beads or sticks or beans. And then you have the more strategy-oriented games, things like chess and Go and Senet, that would stress more military-esque mechanics, like things like taking up more spaces or capturing your opponent's pieces. And a lot of these games were used by people who would, at one point be in charge of armies as a way to like practice their different types of engagements and strategies. So chess was brought to the European continent around 700 AD by the expansion of the Persian Empire into Spain. This is a Persian chess set from the 12th century. In Islam, having very detailed depictions of humans and animals was kind of considered idol worship. So a lot of the chess sets coming out of the Persian Empire or the Persian version tended to be really abstract in their depictions. The pieces are also a little different. So you have elephants instead of bishops, and you have a general or an advisor who is next to the king. These pieces, the game spread over the European continent rather quickly, and it became very, very detailed. Part of this is because during the early Middle Ages, you had this consolidation of power happening among families, and they needed this outward appearance in order to sort of establish their dominance over other families. And chess was one of the many ways they could sort of stamp themselves in positions of power. So this is the Lewis chess set, also from the 12th century. From Scotland. And you can see the pawns are actually really, really abstract. They resemble their more Persian counterparts. The details that are important are these people in power. There are also other changes. Elephants aren't really found in Europe, so they became swapped out with something more familiar, more like elders or bishops. And there's a queen now that sits next to the king instead of an advisor. So the first mention of queen in chess happens around 1000 AD. In a monastery in Switzerland, there was a manuscript that shows the version of chess with a queen in it, as well as instructions on how to play and set up and some strategies for winning. At this time, the queen is the second weakest piece on the board, so she can only move one space diagonal. This is actually an inheritance of the general in the Persian version. So both of these pieces are very, very weak. There is pawn progression, so if you move to the other side of the board, you can have a pawn turn into a queen, but only if there's no other queen on the board. This is different from the Persian version, where you could advance multiple pawns and they could turn into multiple generals. So this doesn't seem to be an issue of game balancing because, again, these pieces are quite weak. It seems to be more about moral reasons, which to me is kind of funny because I can't imagine these pawns being women. Like, I know that they're not very detailed, but it seems weird that they would be okay with like a sex change, but not a king with more than one wife. When this change happened, something else happened to the game of chess in Europe. It had a different narrative now. Instead of being about military conquest, it was about romance. In addition to just, the general turning into a queen, at this time period, most of the pieces in chess were very weak. In order to have any kind of engagement between the two sides would take several moves. So conflict would take a long time. And in order to resolve the game, it would take either a whole day or several days. This was a very long, drawn-out engagement. And if you can think about it visually, these pieces, they can't move the length of the board like we might know of the pieces' behavior in Western chess today. They're very, very weak, and they can only move a few spaces at a time. So they're sort of kind of dancing and flirting around with each other. And so this gives this kind of long, drawn-out engagement of, romance instead of, again, being very aggressive in terms of the narrative. So as a result, because it had this new narrative around being a romantic engagement, chess was actually used by the courtier class, or the middle or upper class, in order to engage in the system that was happening called courtly love, which is sort of a way to kind of improve their social status by showing off how awesome they were and how smart they were and all these talents that they might have acquired in order to pledge their allegiance to this elite family or this high status family. And they usually did that through the woman of the household. So as a result, in order to engage in this dialogue, high status women were encouraged and expected to play chess publicly. And so through about 1000 AD to around 1500 AD, you have this game being known as the game of love. And you have this, dialogue of a lot of women playing the game of chess. Then, in around 1495 in Venice, there's a change that happens to the game. There's another manuscript that actually shows a new rule system called Queen's Chess, or sometimes known as Mad Queen's Chess. And here you have very different pieces. There's the bishop gets much more powerful, the rook gets much more powerful, but the queen goes from the second weakest piece to the most powerful. This change seems to have happened really quickly instead of taking a few decades. And this is because in the manuscript you have the two versions of the game mentioned side by side. You have this game of love, the old version with the slower moves, and you have this new version, and rules of how to play both side by side. So some historians, like Marilyn Yalom, think that it could be powerful women rulers of the time that could inspire such a change. Most notably, Isabella I. She ruled Spain in the late 1400s. She was really powerful and famous. She financed Columbus's journey to the New World, and she was also behind the Spanish Inquisition, so she was loved and hated by a lot of people. But nonetheless, with this new version of the game became much more aggressive. The pieces were much more powerful. They now resemble what we might be familiar with in terms of Western chess. So you can, the queen can now move the entire length of the board, same with a lot of other pieces. And there's this idea that, the pieces themselves are much more aggressive. The games now can be resolved in a few hours instead of taking days. And there's the idea of it being a more military-esque game comes back into the narrative form. And as a result, it's no longer seen as appropriate for high-status women to be playing chess in public. So from the 17th century onward, you sort of have this kind of removal of women playing the game, at least publicly. So in the US, most board games that were being developed and published and advertised to households were advertised to the whole family in mind. This is because a lot of the time they were packaged as educational devices, not just for entertainment, and they advertise themselves as instilling the values of that culture or that time period to the players. So this is The Mansion of Happiness. It came out in 1843. And its goal was to sort of teach people about how to be very, religious or pious, like how to be a good religious person. Toward the later half of the 19th century, you have this move in value systems to this sort of pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality, this whole work hard and climb the corporate ladder. So these are the value systems that were sort of advertised as being instilled to the whole family. And of course, you would want the whole family to participate in this. These are two ads by Parker Brothers in 1897. The one on the left is really interesting because there are two war games that are advertised, the Battle of Manila and the War in Cuba. So yeah, very mixed gender, targeted in terms of, advertising to the whole family. Now there was gender targeting happening in toys around this time. These are two toys from the Sears catalog in 1927. And these are usually, again, divided by the roles and responsibilities those kids would have when they grow up. So things like home economics and sewing would be stressed on little girls. And of course, building career skills and going into the workforce is, something that boys would do. But one thing that was surprising to me is that in the 20s, only about half of all toy ads are gender targeted. So this is a chemical set from 1928 that has both boys and girls conducting experiments with it. And this is an ad from the late 30s that has both boys and girls playing with this farm set. And for most of the 20th century, board games were advertised like this. If you think about family board game night, it's everyone getting together around a table and playing a game. So during World War II in the US, you have a big sort of gender reversal happening. The men are off fighting the war effort, and there needs to be people in order to enter into the manufacturing section so they could keep making planes and tanks and all the things needed for war. So a lot of jobs that were traditionally seen as jobs reserved for just men, women were now participating in. When the war ended, there was this push to revert back to more gender normal roles. Part of the reason is you have men coming home from the war. You want to make sure that they have jobs to come home to. And you also have people wanting to settle down and start families. So there's this kind of pressure of the woman staying home and taking care of the kids and the man going to work. And this was relayed in a lot of TV shows that were getting popular in the 50s. So this is Father's Knows Best. The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, and then you have Leave It to Beaver. And these shows ran from 1950 to around 1966. So in addition to this TV content being put into people's homes, television itself was also changing the way advertising was working. So before, when you were manufacturing a board game, you would, use print ads and radio ads and word of mouth in order to spread your game. But now if your competitor was using television ads, this had a much greater impact in terms of getting that game out there and getting familiarity with viewers. Part of this is because you could easily, target a national audience, and another was just these ads were very engaging at the time. People were watching more and more television and dedicating more time to it. So as a result, it made competing with television ads a lot harder. So this made print advertising and radio advertising a little less efficient in terms of marketing value. In addition, you also have these rise of the big box stores happening in the US, like Macy's and Gimbel's, and this allows retailers to have a lot of power in terms of the content that they would offer their consumers. So before this time, Parker Brothers could make and develop a game, and then they would print it and distribute it to a bunch of smaller shops, like mom and pop stores or department stores or general stores. But now that you had these big box retailers come into the scene, they had much more leverage over what they would want from these game developers. So they would put much more pressure on ensuring that either they would be getting a best-selling game from their stores, like something their customers already wanted and knew how to play, or they would want the game developers to dedicate a big portion of their marketing budget to ensure that their constituents or their shoppers would be familiar with that. So whether that was television, TV, IP tie-ins that would happen, or whether that was guaranteeing that their products would have television advertisements along with developing their games. So these are 2 games of Leave It to Beaver tie-ins. And as a result, video ads became, or television ads became a big part of the developer's budget. It became really a crucial part in, shaping and pitching the game to audiences almost as much as developing the game design itself. So here's a commercial. Oh, I guess you can't hear it. Maybe I can put it on my laptop really loud. I can lean in like this. This would work, right?
The thrilling new Milton Bradley game of romance and mystery that's just for you. And you. And you. Mystery Date.
Right. So you could see like the importance of kind of this like plastic door mechanic and how that like is visually centered in the advertising. So you guys might have probably played this game or at least heard of it. Mystery Date was a pretty big hit that when it came out in 1964. It was published by Milton Bradley, and it involves players going around the board to collect outfit cards. Once they've acquired enough to make a complete outfit, they can go knock on the door and see who is behind it, and if it matches, then they've won the game, and if not, they have to go and collect another outfit. Okay. Aha, fixing audio. All right. So, not only is this game talking about the importance of outward appearance to girls, but you also start to see this trend happening after the war where games are sort of stressing value systems in the fact of consumption itself, of acquiring these outfits. Now, there has been, a lot of consumption in earlier games, but for a lot of the time, they usually stress things like investment or commodities trading. After World War II, you start to see, in at least American games, a lot more stress on consumerism itself, like the value of actually the acquiring of itself, not if it's for financial gain or not. It's just the importance of that. So because of these big budget ads that are happening in terms of, making board games, you start to see a consolidation happening in the board game industry. During the 50s and 60s, you kind of have 3 big players: Milton Bradley, Parker Brothers, and Sell-Chow Writer. You do have more smaller publishers, more indie-esque games that will not have the same reach in terms of, getting their board game out to, tons of people because they don't have big marketing budgets, but they can also take on more risk. They can make more experimental games. And this is one example. This is called He, She, Him, Her. It was made in 1960, and it was developed by Hoi Ploy and published by Rice. In this game, you have a male player and a female player. The male player controls a series of nuts, and the female player controls a series of brass ring pieces. The female player's goal is to get to the corner of the board, and the male's goal is to keep the female player in the giant blue square in the middle marked kitchen. This game is, obviously trying to use a game mechanic in order to teach the inequalities that were happening in terms of gender roles at the time. And these are carried out by turn order cards that players would draw. So, for example, if I draw jury duty as a boy player, it would actually hurt me because I would have to miss work and I would be seen as less, reliant in the office, whereas if I'm a girl, like I'm a stay-at-home mom, so it doesn't affect me. And the inverse for college graduation, right? As a woman, I would lose a turn because, great, what do I get to do with that, right? I get to stay home. And for the, male advances. In this game, what's interesting is that players are encouraged to switch genders. So if you are a girl, you're actually encouraged to play as the male player and vice versa. As an indie, I just love looking back at these games because I tend to think indie developers are like a recent phenomenon, and I forget that there have been indie developers for a long time, as well as people using game mechanics to try to communicate different empathies for different situations or trying to expose an inequality happening in a cultural system. Game mechanics can also be used to push an agenda as well. So this is a racing game called Suffragettes in and Out of Prison. There's a few of these that were printed mostly in newspapers. This one was printed in 1908. The Morning Leader happens to be the paper for the busy man in the home. And as such, this goal of this game is actually to undermine the suffragettes movement by kind of painting them in this light of sort of being these misbehaved women that, you know, keep getting thrown in prison. Okay. So this game, I bet most of you have played before, or if not, at least heard before. This is a very popular game in the US and in Europe. But what you might not know is this game came really close to never existing. That's because when Milton Bradley was publishing or developing it, it got a lot of backlash for being seen as a game that was just too risque. So it was trying to pull the game from production. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the PR company had booked this show on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and they couldn't back out of the engagement. So they went ahead and had him demo the game, and instantly it became a success. People wanted to play this game the next day and sort of forced Milton Bradley to put the game back into production. Milton Bradley still got a lot of slander, I guess, for selling sex in a box when they made this game. The funny thing is, games like Twister were played 100 years earlier, quite commonly among different types of American and European households. These games were known as parlor games, and they ranged from word games or trivia games to more physical games like Twister. So one example of a game that is very similar to Twister was called the Reverend Crowley's game. People would stand in a circle, they would hold hands with the people directly across from each other, and then they would try to twist and contort themselves back into a circle without letting go of each other's hands. An example of a game that is a bit more suggestive, more risque, was called Hot Cockles. In this game, the player who is it has to either stick their head underneath someone's skirt or in their lap, so they can't see who is slapping them in the butt. The point is to guess who is doing the slapping. If they guess correctly, the slapper then has to be it, and if not, the slapping gets rotated among the people watching and playing the game. The interesting thing is this game is quite old. So here it's shown on the left in a book of sports and pastimes. This book was published in 1801. This is a painting, a Dutch painting from the 1700s of the game. And this is a painting actually titled Hot Cockles from France from the 1700s. In addition to games like that, most parlor games had something called a forfeiture state. During the course of the night, if players lost, if they guessed incorrectly, they would have to give something up on them, like a hairpin or a handkerchief or a pocket watch. And then in order to retrieve those items at the end of the night, players would have to do a series of dares. For example, getting blindfolded and kissing the corners of the room. Of course, what would happen is somebody that might admire you would stick themselves between you and the corner, and you would have to kiss them. How horrible. So in a lot of books that were published or pamphlets that would talk about different types of rules and activities for parlor games, the forfeiture state was actually advertised as a way for you to kiss the one you love without nobody knowing it. So this was actually a way to incentivize players into losing on purpose, so they would have to participate in these things. So it's interesting that, these games were happening in, the 1800s, and then you get to Twister and, oh no, sex in a box. But I think, one of the things is Twister's coming out of a much different time period, right? You have birth control, being developed, and this is allowing women to put off starting families and actually going into the workforce and going to get careers. They can then, not have marriage be a part of something that's out of economic necessity, but out of actual desire, right? Like actual human connection. So having a flirting phase is, sort of seen as normal now. Whereas in the 1800s, parlor games were sort of this space etched out that was safe from the impending cultural doom of you can't possibly do these things. There's very strict laws on how you could date. So maybe a lot of this backlash that Twister felt was because the actual culture around was changing. And the story is actually showing up in board games as well. So This is a game called What Shall I Be? The exciting game for career girls, made by Sel Chow and Writer in 1966. As you can imagine, pretty limited choices for girls. In addition to that, you go around the board to collect trait cards in order to get enough traits to get a enough traits to get a career. Unfortunately, the girls' version stressed a lot of outward appearance. Things like your hairstyling and your makeup being too sloppy is things that could help or hurt your career aspirations. A little different from the exciting career game for boys that was printed at the same time by the same company. Their cards did not focus as much on outward appearance. But just 10 years later, in 1976, the company reeditions the board game, and you can see a lot of these changes starting to happen. Now you have women astronauts and surgeons, but in addition to this, you also have girls of color on this board as well. So this is not only just, again, showing the drastic changes happening in the 60s and 70s about gender equality, but also about racial equality, which is pretty cool. And these changes are showing up in toy ads as well. These are two ads from the Sears catalog in 1970. You have a girl playing with a carpenter set and a boy playing with a kitchen set. So the researcher Elizabeth Sweet looked at over a century of toy ads, and she found that in 1975, only 2% of all advertisements were targeted toward one gender. They were either gender neutral or gender reversed. And if you think about it, this makes sense, right? If traditionally you would target a girl or a boy based on the roles that they would have when they grow up, and now women can do anything or at least enter all these fields that were not, traditionally open to them, what would that mean? Like, you would probably want to train both. And in addition, if, girls are now going to be the job holders, maybe the boys would have to learn how to do the housework, right? So these are conversations that were happening in the 70s, and they were showing up in these toy advertisements. So our industry is coming into the scene just around this time, right, in the 70s and early 80s, and we're fitting right into the toy industry in terms of, again, having most of our ads being gender neutral. So we are advertising to, girls and boys almost equally at this time period. The image on the middle and the right are Atari home computer systems from 1980 and 81, and then, of course, the Millipede ad as well. All right, so this is Bargain Hunter. It's a game that came out in 1981 by Milton Bradley. It's a shopping game, and I will show you the video ad for it. Hopefully the audio works this time.
The Davidsons. They're at home looking for bargains. That's Bobby with a stove, radio, and toaster. And Jane has a dresser, clock, and a dog.
It's the exciting game called Bargain Hunter. Makes us really hunt out bargains. Handle money.
And gives us each a credit card, too.
And a credit card machine to run it through.
First to furnish their apartment and be out of debt wins Bargain Hunter.
And that's me.
Bargain Hunter, the bargains game from Milton Bradley.
Yay, shopping. All right. So 7 years later, they come out with this ad.
Got your credit card?
It's Mall Madness.
Sale at the shoe store.
The new shop till you drop game that really talks.
Sale at the fashion boutique.
It's all the fun of a shopping spree. With Mall Madness, you get it all. A bank account and your own credit card.
Clearance at the sunglass boutique.
Mall Madness really talks. To win, buy everything on your list and be first out of the mall.
I win!
Attention mall shoppers.
Mall Madness, the electronic shopping game that really talks. From Milton Bradley. It's the mall with it all.
Yay, more shopping. Right, so Mall Madness, I bet you guys have probably heard of this game, maybe more so than Bargain Hunter, but what you might not know is this is Bargain Hunter. So Bargain Hunter and Mall Madness are made by the same game company, Milton Bradley. They're designed by the same game designer, Michael Gray. And not much has changed in terms of the mechanics or the goals or the outcomes of the game. There is some differences in terms of the board layout space in Mall Madness, but for the most part, it's the same game. The only difference, of course, is that now it's only advertised to half the population. So what happened to have a change like this? What are the reasons behind it? Again, Elizabeth Sweet, who did all this research on toy ads found a really big change that was happening. So you have the 70s and early 80s where almost all of the toy ads are completely gender neutral, and then you get to the 90s and the toy industry has done a 180, and you start to see bifurcation happening along gender lines. So she actually thinks that this change comes down to basically a deregulation that happened in 1984 in the children's television programming. This deregulation allowed toy advertisers to make full-length animations based on selling a toy product. I didn't actually know this until this talk, but He-Man was a toy first before he was an animated TV series. And in a industry paper that came out in 1987, the people who made He-Man were talking about how they were using the television series in order to engage those kids to want to play with He-Man again and again. And some of the things that they were talking about were, well, what are the kids telling when they're playing with these toys? What are the stories that they're sort of like, having in their head about what that character is doing, and how can we bring that to light? And make people want to engage in that toy product, again and again and again. So you have things like, being super strong and being, saving the universe and, being a superhero, basically. This is another example of a toy that started first with an animated TV series around it. My Little Pony from Hasbro in 1986. So again, thinking about what are the stories these kids are playing with these toys and how can we bring them to light? And you start to see these changes happening in the toy industry. And I'll play you this video really quick.
All the girls to buy princesses and all the boys to buy superheroes.
Well, why?
Because girls want superheroes and the boys want superheroes, and the girls want pink stuff and the boys don't want pink stuff.
Right, so that video went viral a couple years ago, but it starts to, she's talking about these differences, right, between princesses and superheroes, right? And this change that's starting to happen in the late 80s and 90s and 2000s is that, instead of traditionally being around the roles that those kids would do when they grow up, although that's still there, you start to see the bifurcation happening along these storylines of superheroes and princesses. So much so that you get this weird, stratification of, crazy pink, like Scrabble being in a pink version, right? It's a little weird. I mean, in some ways, it's, a great way to get the family to buy, two of the same product, right? If you have boys and girls and you want a pink tricycle and you want a blue tricycle, now you have two tricycles, so. And it's also a bit easier to target one segment of the population versus trying to go after everybody. So if you have limited ad dollars, maybe it makes more sense to make something that's super pink or super blue. You could start to see these changes happening so that within 3 decades you have a much different toy industry. And a lot of what's happening is that you have these, bifurcation in the toys, and then these kids get signal messaging about what they should want. If I identify as a girl, I should want the pink aisle because it says girls, toys for girls, right? And then as toy researchers, when they're developing a new product and they're asking kids, well, what kind of toys do you want to play with? They sort of regurgitate this message out that they've been told, and it just sort of cycles out of control. So this is, of course, another image that went viral. But this is, again, not just Lego. This is the entire toy industry. And this has affected our industry, right? We came of age in the toy industry that was very gender neutral, and now we get to the 80s and 90s when we're making all of this cool stuff like, new computers and new consoles, and the toy industry is much, much different now. It's not the same. So it makes sense as to why you would want to stick your new, cool toys in one aisle versus the other. If you had to make a choice, because now that they're different, it would make sense you would put it in the boy aisle if they have more disposable income and if they have more time to play your game. Right? But this doesn't happen without consequence, right? This really impacted our industry. This is the image on the left is the Computer Girls, which is an article about the new cool career option for girls, which is apparently senior systems analyst. This was printed in Cosmopolitan in 1967. So actually in the 70s or late 60s, early 70s, you have a lot of women in computer programming because of the relationship with secretarial work. It was sort of seen as kind of a branch of that. The middle ad, you have a co-op summer coding class for the Atari computer camp. This is coming from the same era, early 80s. And then on the image on the right is Margaret Hamilton standing next to her Apollo 11 code. I didn't actually know this until I did this research, but she's the one that coined the term software engineer. Because she wanted to make software be a science instead of this art, since a lot of women were doing computer science at the time. It was sort of not seen as a science, like hardware was seen as a science, so she wanted to put the engineering as part of that. But yeah, you get to the 80s, the middle of the 80s, and you start to see a drop-off of women entering computer science compared to other STEM fields. And this gender bifurcation, of course, doesn't just impact our industry, it's impacting the larger culture, right, of the US and Europe. And this is showing up in some weird places. So this is the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research, where they ask parents, what are the things your kids are doing, right? And as a result, you see these weird things that are showing up, like girls apparently doing 2 to 3 hours more of household chores a week than boys are, and that's directly impacting their, playtime. So this is kind of odd, right? Because it seems like it's sort of set in this different era of like 1960 or something. And the real world doesn't look like this, right? The adult world doesn't look like this. This is Pew Research Center of women who are the breadwinners of their family. Right, so I think, there's a lot of pressure now and resistance, or at least some awareness of the damage that's happening in terms of these bifurcation of toys. And again, it's not just something that affects girls negatively, right? It also impacts boys, right? We're also telling them, oh, you can't care for somebody else, or you can't cook, or you can't clean, or you can't do all these other activities, right? It's just as harmful. So I think there's again now a pushback to trying to get back to where we were in the 70s. These are 2 ads from Let Toys Be Toys, which is an advocacy group in the UK trying to pressure the toy industries to go back to more gender-neutral targeting. And you're starting to see that. You start to see more, slowly more companies are, trying to go back to where they were in the 70s. In addition to that, we have some TV IPs that are trying to blur the whole superhero princesses thing. And we have some cool television programming for kids that are trying to sort of undo the damage of girls in STEM, as well as getting minorities in STEM as well. So these are all really cool changes, and I hope that they start to kind of eat away at some of the inequalities in tech. In terms of our industry, I think most of us are aware that almost half of the gamers out there are women. And that even when the games that are designed maybe specifically for women, like Candy Crush, they're getting such a big audience that a big chunk of their audience groups are men now that are playing these games. And I think as an industry, we're doing a really great job of understanding how multifaceted our players are, right? And understanding that there are hardcore gamers and casual gamers, and these are the same people, right? They might be on the subway and they want a different game experience, or they might be in front of their computer and they want a longer engaged experience. So, I think we're doing a really great job of trying to, make all these different experiences that our players love. But I think looking back at, this history, it's really important to know that small changes can have these big ripple effects, and that progress is also not linear. It can go backwards as well. So it's really important to know how much power you have as creators, right? You're making these engaging experiences that your players love, and so it's always important to try to take a step back and think, okay, well, what am I saying through my game, and what are our players taking away when they're finished playing our games, and what am I communicating? I have a lot of people to thank because I'm a game designer and not a historian. But I want to thank Alexander Bibier, Margaret Moser, the Strong Museum, of course, which is the museum in Rochester. Marilyn Yalom is the historian with the Chess Info. She wrote a book called The Birth of the Chess Queen. Bruce Whitehill, and Board Game Geek. So thanks, guys. And I think I guess we have time for questions. Do we have time for questions? Awesome. I was trying to go really fast. So.
Hi there. Thanks. That was a great talk. You had a slide up there when you were talking about how the ads were becoming more progressive in, I think you said 1975. There was one shot up there of like a little boy doing the vacuuming while the girl was sitting on the couch. And I wonder to what extent you thought, or it has been discussed, are those ads trying to be progressive, or was that, maybe that ad in particular, I don't know, was it just sort of almost like a shock ad, like a joke ad, as imagine a world where boys would actually do the vacuuming, kind of tongue-in-cheek?
I don't think it was a joke ad just because of the pure quantity of them. Like, It was, again, 97% of them were either gender neutral or gender reverse. So but it could be like, hey, aren't we a cool progressive company, everyone? Like, look at us, we're awesome. It could be that. It could be like, it's really strange to see how different it was in the 70s, but I don't think it was a joke because of just the pure quantity.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Hi there.
Hey.
I'm curious to know that in your research, if you found an age gap that happened at all, like, were games marketed to little girls and then specifically to maybe older women, and sort of a gender gap evolves through the age that the audiences were targeted to?
That's a good question. I think most of this stuff seems to have been middle range. So for like younger kids, it seems to have been mostly gender neutral, like preschool and, K through like 4. It wasn't, of all the games that I've seen that are like super gender targeted, it's always usually around like 6 to 14. And then I don't know if I have any examples of older games or directly targeted to like older, like 16 plus or 14 plus.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Is there any other questions? I guess I'll be around. I think they're going to tear down the stage, but I guess there's a wrap-up room. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, guys. And I hope you are inspired to do more game research, because I can only cover so many topics, right? Like, there's so much more to know about in terms of like Asian games and like, indigenous games and like, looking at race and all this other cool stuff. So I really encourage you guys to like look at history and learn more about what you can discover, because they're usually pretty cool. All right, thanks.